Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic Podcast with Rod Dreher. I'm your host, Kale Zelden, and we are back for episode number 3. Rod, how you doing over there?
I'm doing so much better than I was. I've been in home quarantine for COVID for like 5 or 6 days, but we finally got the test back today. My wife and kids are negative, and I'm sprung.
So you were out of jail, right? So you were in the back room just sort of hanging out by your lonesome for what, 4 or 5 days?
Uh, I think 5 days. It
Oof.
seemed like forever, but
Yeah.
it's really weird because I've been in the house like everybody else for almost a year now,
Mm-hmm.
but it's different when you can walk around the whole house. But when you can only go from the
Yeah.
bedroom to the bathroom, it feels so claustrophobic.
I can imagine. And of course, you forget things like, oh, I need that book, or I want that thing, or I want, and you can't. You're sort of stuck there.
Yeah, I know, but look, I've used the time to try, believe it or not, to get off of Ambien,
Oof.
the sleep med, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
My doctor put me on back in 2008, and I'm like, oh, this is great. This is so awesome. Who knew sleep could be so easy? And then I couldn't get off of it
Yeah.
for 12 years.
Yeah.
But so I've been doing the cold turkey detox thing, and it has been completely miserable. But I think we're over the hump now.
Well, I'm pulling for you here. This is exciting news. I know that these kind of things are tough, but it's good. We were not able to record on our typical Tuesday, but we're here on Wednesday, and perhaps probably appropriate. We saved our recording of episode 3 for Inauguration Day. So here we are, and the Trump era is, at least for this one, is officially done. We'll see what the Senate does, if there's going to be a part 2. But at any rate, it's the beginning of the Biden presidency, and the inauguration was early today. What are your sort of thoughts as you sort of watched the tail end of it? I know you said.
Yeah, I was not a fan of Joe Biden. Am not a fan of Joe Biden. I expect bad things from Joe Biden. But what did surprise me about watching the speech and watching the ritual is what a relief it was to be done with Donald Trump. And that did surprise me because I think what it was is I'm so used to watching the president, meaning President Trump, and being made anxious and angry by what he has to say, either angry at him for something he said or angry with him, meaning that the people he's angry at, I'm also angry at, and he's
Yeah.
gotten me fired up. And this was like a normal guy, and I'd forgotten what it's like to hear a normal president. So
Mm-hmm.
this might be the only day for the next 4 years that I have something good to say about something Joe Biden said, but I was strangely relieved today.
It's interesting. I happened to catch some of Trump's outgoing message. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to any of that, and I must admit, it struck me as, I was sort of conflicted. I it was a good speech, right, and it was not ridiculous, and it kind of made me sort of, I don't know, sad of what could have been if
Yeah.
he had been in any way kind of disciplined or on message. But that's what happens when you get hired because of your sort of rebellious character, that
Hmm.
you lack the kind of discipline to do things. And so I don't know. I was a little struck by a regret, a deep feeling of regret again. And as someone who has you know been a skeptic since before he even won the nomination for the Republican presidential ticket back in 2015 it was. I just, it was kind of sad, honestly.
You know, we, as conservatives, we have always said, always heard said on our side, character is destiny, character really counts. So then along comes Trump, and suddenly a lot of conservatives were saying things like, well, I didn't hire him to be a pastor.
Right.
And look, I get that, but the character thing really came through with him, not in the crude things he said
Hmm.
necessarily, though that was part of it. The real character flaw was a total lack of discipline and the self infatuation, because he came into office and nobody expected him to win, but he came into office He had a Republican majority in both houses of Congress. He could have done some things if he had just stuck with doing two or three things that he promised to do, infrastructure, jobs for the working class, things like that. It could have really he could have had a really good presidency. As it happens, I'm glad we got the judges we got. I'm glad we got the Supreme Court we've got. But yeah, I think that mostly his presidency is one of missed opportunities.
Yeah, and just quickly, I think that, many people in the audience perhaps might mistakenly sort of categorize you as a kind of never Trumper. And I anytime that comes up with my personal conversations with friends, like that has never been sort of your perspective. It's, you have regularly sort of I get the sense from a lot of never Trumpers that they were sort of into what you've dubbed, other people have dubbed, kind of zombie Reaganism.
Yeah.
But that's why I think it's upsetting, is that there seemed to be an opportunity that perhaps electorally a conservative movement could have broadened itself out and kind of talked its way off of the cliff of the worship of markets and all of that, and sadly here we are, and it's the end, and really botched it more than anything. And I think the character thing for me, where it really manifested itself, was just the abomination of the sixth.
Yeah.
It that's where I think the character thing really came into play for me, just in terms of my assessment of the whole era. Obviously, there were plenty of issues, good things and bad things, but again, not an apologist. But what, if you don't mind, I'd like to take us in this direction. Earlier today, you on your blog, you had a lengthy sort of, you talked a little bit about how you were surprised that you were kind of relieved by the kind of normalcy, at least even just for a few hours. There was sort of a relief of normalcy. But at the end of that post, you brought up Matt Iglesias, once of Vox.com, if I'm not mistaken, right? Can you talk a little bit about why you were moved to sort of bring Matt Iglesias up, and just remind us of the tweet?
Sure. Matt Iglesias, who is now an independent writer, but he's on the left, he said that conservatives need to stop and think about how the things that concern them the most do not have answers in electoral politics. And I don't know if you can say that generally about conservatives across the board, but certainly you can for social and religious conservatives like us. I think that it's certainly true that the thing that concerns me the most is that our country has forgotten God and is forgetting God. Well, no president, that's not the fault of the president, and no president can make us remember God. The family is falling apart, and families are falling apart. There's not a whole lot that any president can do to make a major difference there, maybe around the margins. But this is something that has to happen, that we have to do for ourselves. Loss of cultural memory.
That's where I think that's great too, right? Family, but this cultural memory thing. Can you talk a little bit about the cultural memory and the story?
Yeah, well, I talk about this in my book, Live Not by Lies, about how one thing totalitarian governments do is to try to erase the cultural memory of a people, by which I mean the things that people remember about their culture and their culture's past and their history that tell them who they are and what they're supposed to be doing. Well, we are losing that in a big way here in America today. And we're losing it in part because it's being erased by universities, by the media, and who all want to deny the past and create a new past for us to remember as a way of controlling the future. But it's also being erased by the fact that we just don't care.
Yeah, I know, and I saw that a lot, as I'm a teacher, and I saw that a lot with students and just sort of perspectives on history, for instance. And, I think conservatives in general have in large part focused on, legislative issues and political issues and economic issues. And all the while, departments of history and education have really done a number on the framing of history, right? And so I think in many respects you can say that the millennials and those folks who have sort of followed them into kind of a sort of a largely kind of woke perspective are really kind of like the Howard Zinn generation. They have learned nothing but problematized history in which they've learned to hate everything about the founding of the country. And I agree with what you've said before about this sort of this business with the 1619 project, that the 1619 project is kind of the apotheosis of that whole movement, right? That the founding of the country is not based upon these ideals and this idea as enumerated in the Declaration and the Constitution and the founding fathers and all that. It is instead 1619. It is instead, the founding of the country is this sort of originary slavery. And who can be proud of that? I mean, rightfully, right? I mean, who can be proud of that?
Yeah, that's true. And I think that it's certainly correct. I would say that this only heroic, kitschy idea of America, the cherry tree, George Washington, the cherry tree, that sort of thing. We don't need that. We need something that's more balanced and truthful. But the 1619 project and things like that, woke history, strikes me as just, the left-wing mirror version of kitschy right-wing history. But
so true. So true.
And it's frustrating to me because this really does matter. What the way people remember the country really does matter. And I was reading something this week, maybe Christopher Rufo, that the blogger and the writer from the Pacific Northwest who writes about wokeness and education. I think he retweeted something talking about the standards in maybe Minnesota schools, where they're going to talk all about LGBT, contemporary racial figures and all that. But some of the major events like World War I get only like a page. Yeah. These are the new standards, and this is incredibly political and incredibly damaging. Here's the thing, though. We, the people, have the capability. If our schools won't give it to us and we can't, our elected school board leaders are going along with this, we have not only the capability, but the responsibility to do this for ourselves and to teach our kids ourselves in the same way that Václav Benda, the anti-communist dissident in Prague that I write about a lot in my work, he and his colleagues did this for their kids and their young people. In the communist era, they knew these kids were getting nothing but lies and propaganda in the government schools, so they would bring people together in their private time and lecture them about real history, about real literature. It was something they did as a matter of cultural survival, not because it seemed good to them, because it took a lot out of their kids' lives, but they did it so their kids would not forget who they were.
Yeah, and that idea of like the controlling of the memory and I think both of us are as suspect of the kind of whitewashed, vision of American history as we are a suspect of it's all genocide from soup to nuts. But there doesn't seem to be a recognition on the part of many people that this style, this attitude, this positionality toward the story of the country matters. I get the sense, it's I don't know why I just had the image of Rex Mottram pop into my head.
You got to explain who that is.
Yeah, so Rex Mottram is from Brideshead Revisited. He's this American industrialist, I think, right? One of the sort of Canadian, North American, figure, and he's all about business, and this is in Brideshead Revisited, and that figure in British literature, especially from mid-Victorian period all the way into the middle of the 20th century, there's this sort of stock figure of the kind of crass North American who like just cares about business. They're all basically versions of Henry Ford, right? And Henry Ford's classic line is "History is bunk," right? That fine, like you can waste all your time talking about history and talking about literature and stories, but really, like, I'm here to make money. And I think that we are paying dearly, honestly, for that kind of attitude toward our story as a nation and as a culture. And that doesn't mean that you have to sit here and lie about slavery or what we did to the Native Americans as official, policy. It doesn't mean that we have to lie about what the FDR government did to Japanese Americans during and before and during the Second World War. And in fact, I think the great antidote to any of these sort of very simple binary black and white, good and bad history, is to sort of teach the whole story,
Sure.
kind of warts and all. And yet we really have neglected that. We've abandoned it entirely, it seems to me. And it seems to be taken up entirely by motivated actors who are explicitly ideological in the way that they see the world and the way that they operate in the world.
It's interesting you bring that up. I have been reading in my confinement a book called Destiny Denied. I think that's the name of it. The author's Tamim Ansari, Ansary, and it's a history of the Muslim world, or history of the world told through Muslim eyes.
Wow.
And it's a fascinating book. It's written for the general reader like me.
Yeah.
And what Ansari sets out to do is to explain to the Western reader how the history of the world looks, well, from Muslim eyes. But what for me was so interesting about it is I'm learning things I've never learned about how the Muslim community came into being and how it was from the very beginning, because this is in the structure of Islam, how the state and the religious community are the same thing. What's so interesting at this point, I'm about 600 years into Islamic history now, and we've gone through a number of generations of Muslim leadership. So interesting to see how everything started out so pure in the generation of Muhammad, but the further you get away from that founding generation, the more the complexities of the world and the complexities of human nature compromise the purity, and then people start to split apart. Why do I bring that up here in this discussion? Because history is so fascinating. I can look back, I'm reading this Muslim history, and I'm somebody who, as a Christian, doesn't believe that God had anything to do with this, except maybe in the broadest sense of his permissive will. So I see the religious conflicts going on there as purely human things. But if you're Muslim, you believe that God's hand was in this and was on one side or the other. So I think all of this is so important for us to learn, because once you look at on the outside looking in at the Muslim community and also being given a Muslim insider view, you can understand how the currents of history work in our society. And the reason I brought it up for here is that why history matters so much. Last night, a part I was reading was about this medieval Islamic scholar named Ghazali, and he was like probably the greatest scholar of all time. Mm-hmm. And he was so good at what he did that his work ended up basically crushing the Islamic medieval philosophical tradition, which was bringing in all the Greeks. And, they were really on top of the world at that time, when in the West, we were just learning how to read after the Dark Ages.
That's right.
And it was incredible to me how the victory of this man, of Ghazali, and he was so talented that and there were some other things involved too, but it just crushed Islamic science, the development of Islamic science and philosophy, and led to the downfall of Islamic influence. So this stuff does matter. Ideas do matter. Ideas do have consequences. So when you and I are talking about what's happening in our society and in our schools about not learning certain kinds of history, or learning history from a really narrow, rigid, ideological point of view, this is going to have consequences.
Yeah, and they become, I think it shrinks the world unnecessarily, right? Rather than giving you a sort of a perspective from which you can kind of take things in and expand out. You shrink down, and so you look for kind of, I guess, sort of perspective hacks, right? Ways of sort of taking complexity and simplifying it. And I'm struck with the way in which we as human beings, cultures have a problem, I think, with complexity, right? I mean, complexity robs us of your sort of a quick ability to sort of, what's good, what's bad, right? And I am in this moment, right? A new fight that I see kind of emerging, especially in the wake of the Capitol Hill riot. That it's and one of my favorite podcast hosts, by the way, shout out to Eric Weinstein at the Portal podcast. But he was on a Glenn Beck podcast the other day, and he talked about the emergence of Wokistan versus Magastan, sort of the
Hmm.
forces of the woke left and their own versions of a kind of very simplified history, taking out all of the complexity of history. And then the Magastan, that's similar, but on the opposite side of the so-called spectrum of sort of oversimplifying it. And this goes back to something that you and I have been talking about maybe offline, but the emergence over the summer, this past summer, of the BLM riots and the woke left there. But then, of course, I was hit like a ton of bricks with something that I have completely ignored, to be honest with you, which is the Q phenomenon.
Oh,
And yeah, and I really and I do think it's worth a deep scrutiny, um, just in terms of it as a phenomena, especially since I'd completely ignored it personally. It was so absurd on the face of it for me personally. But you actually sent me to an article from the Atlantic by Adrienne LaFrance, I believe. Um, I think it's called "The Prophecies of Q" or something, or what?
yeah. She
Yeah,
writes about it as a new religion,
yeah,
basically.
and I actually quibble with her a little bit about it as a new religion. I think this might be a little bit of a tangent, but I'm going to say it because that's just how I am. I really like what she's brought together in that article. I'll link to it in the show notes later on if you're interested. But she suffers from the way that the cathedral, as you have talked about before, she really doesn't understand religion.
Well,
She
let me just stop you right there for a
Yeah,
second. The cathedral is a neo-reactionary term that they use to describe the sort of the blob of the state, of the media, the university, all of the institutions that set the official reality.
good,
I mean,
good, right.
it's a term of opprobrium, but I think it's a
Yeah.
great term.
Yeah, I think it works. And I live up in New England, and I think New England is one of the epicenters, right, of the sort of the articulators of the cathedral. And so I'm reading this piece, and she does a wonderful bit of she pulls together some amazing things, but I do think she misses something essential by calling it a new religion. I think it shows that she doesn't fully understand what religion is. At any rate, Q really deserves our discussion, because we, especially those of us who are social conservatives and religious conservatives, need to recognize the deep tentacles that it has had on American Christianity. And again, I feel like I've whiffed on this one a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, and as I'm reading this piece, it's hard to ignore, that Q comes out of a deep American sort of apocalyptic tradition. I'm reminded I reminded of the 90s, and when everybody was getting worked up about the Y2K thing, and all of my evangelical friends were obsessed with the Left Behind series, and the imminent, rapture was going to happen any moment. And so I think what LaFrance misses is that this is part of Christianity, right? Not it's a
Mhm.
crippled version of Christianity, you know, um, clearly, but it's part of the sort of the Christian messianic tradition.
But I would even quibble with that a little bit because
Okay.
one of the things I learned in researching "Live Not by Lies" is how Bolshevism, it was anti-Christian, but it did appropriate Christian messianic apocalyptic tropes, and so yeah,
So,
I mean,
so I'm going to trump you again on that one. So,
do it.
so yeah. So taking a cue from Tom Holland, right, in his book Dominion, he would argue, and I think there's real textual evidence for this, although he doesn't get into this so much, that Marx has essentially taken the Christian eschaton, that is the Christian promise of the heaven that awaits the righteous at the end of time, and has placed it inside of time. And so that the
Mhm.
vision of communism, right, this communist utopia, is basically it's a fundamentally Christian idea. It's an atheist Christian idea, but it's a Christian
Mhm.
idea, right? So I would agree that Marxism traffics on this very same thing. So I'm not surprised that the
Right.
Bolsheviks were triggered for you.
So it's interesting to think of Q and wokeness are as parallel
I
phenomena, right?
yes, and they feed off of one another, by the way.
They do. And, I've said something like that on my blog or on Twitter, and people on the left get so crazy. Like, how
Yeah,
dare you say wokeness and Q are the same thing? Because Q is crazy, but clearly we on the woke side, we mean well, and we're standing talking about real things. And I think that they're different only superficially. But what I think is so interesting about the Q thing is how it was a religion, a pseudo religion of revelation. They kept waiting for the prophet Q to tell them these gnomic statements about what was really about to happen. I noticed
the Q droppings, they call it Q droppings.
How they call it?
Them. Yep.
Yeah, and today we're talking on Inauguration Day. I saw on Twitter some tweets, some statements from Q message boards about some of these people are having real cognitive epistemic crises because they can't deal with the fact that it's not true. And one of the guys who was one of the chief facilitators of Q online, and some people thought he might have been Q himself, he put a tweet up saying, well, I enjoy that we all got to meet each other, and maybe the real Q was us becoming friends in this journey. Stay tuned for my next project.
Amazing, by the way, amazing that emerged. That, oh well, maybe I was all wrong, and people are really. I mean, look, to me, as I looked at all the footage of the riot on Capitol Hill, you have a lot of evangelical hand wringing because they're saying, oh well, this is sort of Christian nationalism and all that. I don't fully think it is, but it's clearly Q inflected and Q infected sort of messianic Christianity. I don't think there's any getting around that.
Yeah, and I don't think that Q and MAGA are the same thing necessarily. They become tangled up with each other, but I think there's some people who don't even know who Q is or what the Q phenomenon is, who do believe Donald Trump is sort of a secular messianic figure. And a lot of these people are Christians, but they see him as being, him and his person as being a figure on whom everything hung. Somebody said the other day, and maybe it was one of my comments on my blog, said that Trump has driven all debate about principle out of the Republican Party. And now the only debate is whether you're pro or anti-Trump. I think that's a really shrewd observation, because I can't think of the last time I had an argument with a fellow conservative about anything that the right is supposed to be in favor of or against. It's all been about Trump the man. Which is how Trump wants it.
Well, and I think, maybe doing a little mind reading of my own with you, I think perhaps that's in part that was the kind of relief I think you were sensing today, is that maybe in the coming days, as a social conservative, I can think about something else besides whatever it is he's tweeting about today, right? I mean, I think there's a reality to that, right? But talking about reality, right, I think what the woke left and the Q right, for lack of a better, Wokistan versus Magastan, right, as Eric Weinstein would have it. I think this gets into another thing that you posted over the weekend, which was the lengthy and I think brilliant piece by James Lindsey on his website, New Discourses, on psychopathy. I don't remember the name of the piece off the top of my head. Again, I'll put the link to the article in the description of the video here today. But he talks about pseudo realities and the emergence of literally of alternate realities. And I think that what you're seeing with both of these crippled ideologies, or these crippled worldviews, which is I think what an ideology is, it's a worldview meant to service people who don't have a full grasp on reality.
Right. Yeah, I think it's an interpretation of reality that people mistake for reality itself. And that piece by Lindsey is really, really good. It's very long, it's very dense, but it's rewarding. And he talks about how we should understand what we're living through right now as a conflict of realities, and that's a really dangerous thing, because if you remember Alistair McIntyre back in the early 80s in his book After Virtue, he talked about how discourse was difficult and almost impossible because we couldn't even agree on basic premises. Now, he's talking about moral philosophy and moral discourse. This takes it even a step further, where we can't even agree on what happened. You know,
Well, yeah, right. I mean, what is at stake is precisely reality, and people, I think, is sort of in a sort of a fit of exasperation might be like, I don't even think we're looking at the same reality, and I think the answer to that is you're correct. We are not looking at the same reality, right? Because for a variety of different reasons. But what I loved so much about uh, Lindsey's piece, Psychopathy and the Origins of Totalitarianism, is that he really doesn't pull any punches. That he says that the consequences of these crippled worldviews, right? These worldviews in which are explicitly crafted for people who, he just lays it out. He says it must be observed. I'm quoting here. It must be observed that people who accept pseudo realities as though they are real are no longer normal people. And one of the things I love about reading Lindsey is that he knows this stuff backwards and forwards. If you listen to him and you read his stuff, this is a smart guy, but he doesn't have the kind of uh, ivory tower niceties that you would expect for someone who knows this sort of stuff, because he's not jockeying for a job. He's not part of the show, and he'll just say, and we know exactly what he means by this. When again, I'm going to say it one more time, it must be observed that people who accept pseudo realities as though they are real are no longer normal people, and we have to just be able to say that out loud. Right?
well,
this is not normal.
here's where a problem I had with what Lindsey had to say, though, and I'd be interested to
Yep.
talk to him about it. He is an atheist. He's been open about being an atheist. I wonder to what extent he realizes that atheism and empiricism is itself a constructed worldview. And he doesn't. I think he would probably say that you and I, as Christians, live in a pseudo reality.
Sure.
How do we deal with that and live in reality in the sense that you and I think we should live in reality?
Sure.
But for us, believing in God and believing in Jesus Christ is part of that reality.
Sure. Okay. Well, this is what my fantasy, my dream here is to have, you and I sitting down with James Lindsey and Tom Holland, because I think that Lindsey's issue here is that I don't think he understands fully the genealogy of liberalism as as an outgrowth of a Christian worldview. Right? Like there's a reason why liberalism exists in the West, right? And my, issue with a lot of these sort of former new atheists in people of goodwill like Lindsey and some of his friends is that they aren't fully aware of where these so-called quote unquote Enlightenment values come from. Right. And I think Holland, the British historian Tom Holland, especially in his book Dominion, really traces out this long story, that the difference maker in his way of thinking is ultimately Christianity. And I think he would even get more specific and more granular, and he would say St. Paul, right? But Lindsey so he writes this piece. This is funny. He publishes it on Christmas Day on December 25th. And then about a week later, he puts out a podcast, which is kind of a hour-long sort of explanatory podcast on what he wrote. And it's a great thing. I recommend it. I guess I'll put that in the notes too for this show. But in the podcast, he ends the podcast by saying, guys, we cannot let go of the Imago Dei. We cannot let go of the idea that we are made in the image and likeness of God. Now, Lindsey is an out loud atheist. He is not shy about any of this sort of stuff. But I think he's starting to grasp the inescapability of that particular miracle. I've listened to hours and hours and hours of Jordan Peterson's podcast and whatnot, and he himself is a non-believer, right? But somebody who knows the tradition very well. He himself says that there are a few things that are not at all evident, right? But and he says, and I can only see them as being miracles. And what he talks, and he says it's a Jewish thing. It's the Jewish thing, which is simply all of us are icons of the divine creator. He says that there's no such thing as law without the Imago Dei. There's no such thing as human dignity without the Imago Dei. And so I think that I'm fascinating as I kind of watch these guys break these things down, and they're doing great work. And I'm trying to take no shine off of somebody like Lindsey, but to your point, do they fully appreciate? They would perhaps, maybe James, and again, he seems like a nice enough fellow, might say that, well, Kale, you and Rod, you're living in a pseudo reality.
Sure. But I guess the question I'm asking too is how does somebody like you and me talk about people need to live in reality and not in Wokistan or Magastan, and at the same time defend the fact that we believe that when a priest, a validly ordained priest, says certain words over certain gestures over bread and wine, they become the body and blood of Jesus. I think the answer to that is along the lines of overlapping magisteria of truth. That.
What do you mean by that, Rod?
Well, I mean by that is science. Well, let me back up a little bit. Amir Tamim Ansari, who wrote the book about Islam I was talking about, he talks about how the West figured out the whole revelation versus empiricism question by deciding that certain questions belong to the realm of theology and philosophy, and some certain questions belong to the realm of science. In Islam, they all were part of the same realm, and rather than separating them out and find a way to separate them out, revelation ended up overtaking everything, which crushed the development of science. So what does that have to do with us? I think it means that, when you and I are talking about, as Christians, about the ultimate nature of reality, we would say it is divine, it is theological. Sure. But we can sit around with our neighbors of different faiths or no faith at all and should be able to agree on basic facts and principles, from which we can therefore reason. And we can sure. rule some things as out of bounds for political discussion because they're not real.
So put some meat on those bones. What do you give me an example, maybe?
Why are you doing this to me?
I'm sorry.
No, I'm kidding. Well, I'm kidding. No. Well, no, I think about the Q people, right? I got into an argument. This is when I first really heard about Q. It was about a year ago. I was at a wedding, and I saw somebody, a wealthy, educated businessman I know, and he started asking me about Q. He knows I work for the American Conservative. Started asking me about Q, and he started laying out this conspiracy because he's a believer. And I said, "But that doesn't make any sense. How do you know that's true?" He kept saying, "Well, how do you know it's not? How do you know it's not?" Sure. Right there, Kale, is an example. You say, "Wait a minute, time out. We don't say that because you can't prove something that makes it true." But this guy is that a dog?
Yes.
Are you squishy?
It was a squishy toy.
Well,
go ahead. Sorry.
But seriously, though, that right there is an example of not being able to talk in reality. I could talk with a Democrat who we may disagree on principles, on political principles, but he's not going to be the sort of person, unless he's woke, who comes in and, with this pseudo-science or this pseudo-logical claims and take a stand on that and say the only way you can, if you disagree with me, then you're evil.
Right. But this is where I want to push back a little bit. I think we can't do this move where we just simply ignore Q as clear bat crappery and not look at how and why it has some kind of explanatory power, because I think it does. For it to have the kind of influence that it has to some way speak to an experience of reality. And so I lay it out this way. As a conservative, Rod, do you feel like our cultural and religious and political elites have lied to us?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that.
So correct. You and I would both agree. So right now, you and I are at least sort of nodding along with the Q folks, right? Because one of their predicates is that there's a cabal of elites who run everything, right? And this is the kind of thing. You go back to the Middle Ages, and in fact, I wanted to bring up another book. If anybody in the audience is interested in this kind of thing, Norman Cohn wrote an incredible mid-century history on medieval millenarian movements that really show that it's kind of baked into the cake of Christianity. But my sense of that is that, as Christians, there's always a tension between this basic quotation, "You know not the time nor the hour," period,
Mhm,
and the other quotation, which is, "You always must read the signs of the times."
mhm.
Right. So as Christians, we're kind of stuck, and not stuck, but we're in between those two things, right? And both of them sort of, there's a sense of knowing, right? So there's a kind of, so you can see why I think Gnosticism, this Gnosticism is attractive, right? And so what Q allows for the adherent is that, I can see what's going on.
Sure.
This is the truth, and nobody wants to admit it, right?
Right. It gives you a sense of security in the face of chaos, because even though things look like they're chaotic and crazy, you
Yes.
know what's really happening.
Yeah.
And you alone, you and your confreres have the key to understanding reality. That makes perfect sense for what we're going through right now. We're going through a time of great turmoil in this country, certainly in the wake of COVID, of so many things happening. And we have evidence with the Epstein stuff, with the
That's right.
scandal in the Catholic Church, and on and on and on, that corrupt elites really do exist within our institutions. But this is human nature. I think that another thing, too, that this sort of apocalyptic millenarian ways of thinking, it gives you a sense and a reason to hope that there will be a day of reckoning at which all things will be revealed. The sheep will be separated from the goats will be thrown into the fire, and so on and so forth. This is what happened with the Bolsheviks. This was part of the reason they won over so many people, because poor people thought, finally, we will see real justice. And I think in the case of the Q people, when you look at their crazy prophecies, if you understand it through the point of view of this is how millenarianism works, that they speaks to a fear of chaos and a longing for justice.
Correct. Amen. That's exactly right. You long to see the order in the perception of utter and total chaos, and that it means something, and that it's ordered towards something, and there's justice at the end, right? So I get, again, I think Q is a huge problem. I think that there's sort of a specific version of it in evangelical circles. I think there's a specific version of it in sort of conservative Catholic circles that's worth a sort of a deeper dive on. But they're both pseudo gospels,
Yep.
right?
And one thing that Lindsey says in that essay, and this is really important, he says that when the pseudo realities, when they get what they're after,
Power.
but when they achieve what they're after, and the world has not become utopia, then they have to double down on it and have to push even harder and harder. This is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union, right? They and it will, if Trump had won re-election, they would have continued the conspiracy out further and further and further, because that was the only way to keep the prophecy from being unfulfilled. And in the same way with wokeness, if they got everything they wanted and still we didn't live in utopia, what would be their answer then?
There's none. Right?
There is
There's
none.
none.
No.
All right. Well, we're here at the end here, and I promised you that we would talk a few minutes about happy things or hopeful things. Not happy things, hopeful and meaningful things. Maybe that's what we'll call this segment. But where have you found some hope and light here in the midst of all of this mess?
Believe it or not, I found one of the happiest moments I had in this past week was in the company of Fran Lebowitz, the raconteuse in New York. She was a big celebrity in the 70s. She's a public speaker and a writer, though she hasn't written anything for decades. She was a big 70s figure. She's this grumpy Dorothy Parker-like New York Jewish woman. And there's a new movie out. It's only like an hour and 15 minutes. Martin Scorsese did it for Netflix. It's called Pretend It's a City. And it just follows Fran Lebowitz around New York City and takes bits of her giving her public speeches. She gives an interview to Scorsese, making jokes and witticisms about life in New York. This made me so happy to watch it, Kale, because not only is she so wonderful in her curmudgeonliness, but I lived in New York from 1998 to 2003. And for me, this was probably the best time of my life. I was newly married. I was young, new to the city, no kids to sort of, which it's hard to live in the city with kids, but my wife and I would just gallivant around Manhattan, and Fran Lebowitz brings it all back. Plus, I have to say, just the joy of Jewish culture, of being in a city where there are people like Fran Lebowitz everywhere with that kind of humor, that kind of liveliness, that kind of urbanity. I just loved it. And the movie, it's stitched together these little set pieces with Fran Lebowitz with this jazzy soundtrack. And it just had me, it was like listening to Gershwin or something, Rhapsody in Blue. I just was thrilled by it.
That's great. Well, my sort of joy that I've sort of stumbled into this week, maybe we can talk at length about it later on, but is I'm actually listening to a book on tape, which is something I don't usually do. I got an Audible membership over Christmas, and I'm listening to a book called The Memoirs of St. Peter, and it's a translation by Dr. Pakaluk. I think that's how you say his name. Mm-hmm. And for our audience, if you haven't heard it, you should pick it up. It's as if you're sitting next to St. Peter or Peter, Simon Peter, listening to him tell stories about this guy, this God man that he knew in Galilee. I mean, it's just really an amazing book. It really it brings you right there to the action, so to speak. And by the way, the commentary that's appended to the end of each of the chapters of the 16 chapters of the Gospel of Mark are there, and they're brilliant. So
yeah, well, he thinks that St. Peter wrote Mark, is it? Is that
basically that Mark is his secretary, and that sort of St. Peter was sort of telling him the story, which again, and he has a little explanation at the opening of it as to why he's sort of going with this. And it's part of tradition, of course. But it's just wonderful. It's a wonderful book. I recommend you listening to it. It's been a great part of my morning routine. So,
well, can I tell you, Kale, this people who are listening to this won't see this, but those who watch it can. I'm wearing this Brooklyn sweatshirt. It's a hoodie. I got this in 98 or 99. It was dark blue, and now it's very faded, kind of blue gray. But it is
decidedly not dark blue now.
No, not dark blue. It is sort of a relic of that time. But I can remember my wife and I, toward the end of our time in New York, we'd had a baby by then, and we were getting ready to leave. And she said, New York is like living in Disneyland. Everything is so vivid and magical, but it costs 5 times more than it does in the real world.
That's right. It's like, I remember that the last time I was in the city, I was at a wedding, and I felt like I had to spend $30 just walking from one corner of the block to the next block. Money just sort of flies out of your pockets because everything is there. But I miss the city.
Yeah, and I know we only got a couple of minutes left, but I want to make a plug briefly for this another great Netflix movie called My Octopus Teacher. It's a nature documentary, and normally that would make me fall asleep right there, nature documentary. But this is so different. It's about a nature filmmaker, a guy named Craig Foster, South African, who got to the middle of his life, burned out. He started diving in a lagoon near his house on the South African coast, and he started exploring a kelp forest, got to know, quote unquote, this octopus who lived there, and started following her around. And it ended up, they developed this really interesting relationship. Octopi are really smart.
Yeah.
And by the time it was over, I was almost in tears. But what's so interesting about it is Foster talks about how just spending the year of that octopus's life, because they only live about a year, exploring and following her and getting to know the natural world, it pulled him out of himself and re-enchanted the world for him. I watched that and I loved it so much, and I've been recommending it to everybody. But for me, it made me realize how nature doesn't do anything for me. Going to big cities around the world, meeting people like Fran Lebowitz and other people that I met, that's what re-enchants the world for me. And that's why I cannot wait for COVID to be over so I can travel again and meet people and become re-enchanted again.
Well, and it would be nice, of course, to be able to do a session or two in person together, as we're both sort of in different regions of the country right now. So here, hopefully this coronavirus is on its last leg. So, all right, well, Rod, this has been a great episode. Thank you for sitting with me and talking through a variety of different things. Folks, if you could like and subscribe to the podcast here on YouTube. We do expect this to be up and on the major podcast audio formats very shortly here. And we have some more announcements coming next episode. So until then, how's our sign off, Rod?
Don't get nothing on you.
All right, Uncle Bubba. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.